Hello, everyone. My name's Sam Browse. I'm one of the volunteer team behind the Arise Festival, which this event is part of, and also a kind of activist and volunteer with the Orgreave Truth Justice Campaign as well. It's my absolute pleasure to facilitate this discussion today. It's called No Justice, No Peace. What is working class justice and how do we get it? Which is part of the annual Arise Festival, like I said. Today we're here to talk about working class injustice from miners who were brutally attacked and subsequently fitted up by the police at Orgreave during the 1984-85 miners' strike, to the 72 people who were killed in the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. Working class people and communities have often been denied justice for the violence and mistreatment and neglect they've experienced from the state. Today we're here to talk about why that might be, how we build campaigns that are about resisting that and those injuries and those injustices to working class communities, and what justice looks like for working class people. So I'm really, really pleased to be joined by Kate Flannery from the Orgreave Truth Justice Campaign, Yvette Williams from the Justice for Grenfell campaign, and Matt Foote, who is the author of the book Charged: How the Police Tried to Suppress Protest. Before I go to the speakers though and begin the discussion, I'd just like to remind you that if you enjoy the discussion today and these kind of events, there's plenty more where they came from. So do check out the full program of events that Arise have got planned. You can find that in the links below the YouTube video. Just follow the links through and you'll see everything that we'll be discussing. It includes a dizzying array of speakers from not only Britain but across the world, from the labour movement, from social justice movements, and from progressive political parties as well. I'd also like to emphasise as well, and this is sort of the obligatory plug, we're a volunteer organisation. It is an ambitious project, and ambitious projects don't happen on their own. We're funded by the likes of people watching the video, so please, this video today, so please do donate if you can, and you can follow the links to the donating page below this video as well. Okay then, like I say, thanks very much for joining us today, and without further ado, let's kick off the discussion. So we're here to talk about working class injustice and how we right wrongs, if we can right wrongs, against working class communities, and how we build movements to do that. And I think it'd be good to start with quite a fundamental question, which is, what do we mean by a working class injustice? What does that mean? So perhaps if we go to Yvette first, maybe you could talk us through what do we mean by a working class injustice and how your campaign links that idea.
The biggest injustice of all that makes us who we are as the working class is that we're just continuously exploited. And then further to the exploitation, you know, they just ruin us even more. So we don't even have, you know, the basic things that, you know, a human being should be promised. A basic home. We have to fight for homes. Do you know what I mean? There's a housing crisis. You know, social housing is in a really ridiculous state. You know, we're crushed by the police continuously, our communities. They don't criminalize us. Then actually they kill us, as we see in Grenfell. You know, that we have battles with you know, education system in terms of, you know, pushing our children through. You know, we can't feed our children. You know, we're suffering poverty. So on top of the basic exploitation that our society is made up of, you know, with one class kind of just exploiting the other class and pushing, they just push us down further. And it's, you know, you come to a point where, you know, how much more can we really take?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Baby Q case shows, you know, when they're strip searching Black children in school, and that just terrible case of Bibba Henry and Nicole Smallman, when the police come to a scene of two murdered Black sisters and photograph them and share them around a WhatsApp group. I think what that reflects is a sort of dehumanizing of civil society that is really quite extreme and completely endemic. It's obvious that's not the first time that's happened, or that, you know, the WhatsApp group in Charing Cross. Not there's a culture where, if that's what they think of people who've been murdered, you know, what do they think of protesters and, you know, people who are trying to bring change to society? And I think it's really, you know, the culture is really sort of sophisticatedly bad. I mean, it's just on a different level, and so I think we're just inevitably going to see, in terms of policing in the state, more working class injustices because of what we're up against.
Yeah, like Kate, I
And
guess.
I think, yeah,
Orgreave's a great example of that, isn't it?
Yeah, and just going back to basics, we live in a class-ridden society. It's a society that's structured as a hierarchy, and the people who want that hierarchy to continue and maintain that hierarchy through their own laws and their own parliamentary systems and structures to keep working class people like us well and truly in our place. It's in their interest to do that. And they will use whatever power is necessary to make sure that working class people are subjugated and oppressed. And I know that sounds like, something that might be in an A-level textbook or something, but that's the reality. We live in a class-ridden society. And, the sooner people recognise that, the sooner it will be for us to be able to change things, because the ruling class now, we live in a class-ridden society. They're constantly telling us that we're not, that we're all one class and we're all in it together. But that's just patently not true. And, we've seen how the police behaved during the miners' strike, how they behaved before the miners' strike, how they behaved since the miners' strike, and what they're prepared to do to put working class people well and truly in their place, and then to lie about it afterwards to cover up, to cover their tracks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting to like maybe draw those connections between Grenfell and the way the police behave, and especially how they behaved historically with at Orgreave. So yeah, like Yvette, Grenfell's been called a social murder by politicians and by academics too, and activists on the ground. What does that mean? And do you think it's a good description of what happened to Grenfell? And I guess Kate and Matt, what do you think is that thread that connects that idea and connects Grenfell to Orgreave and to the wider issue of how the state and police behave towards working class communities? And you've kind of touched on that a bit already, I guess. So maybe kick off with Yvette.
I think we could glamorise it and call it manslaughter instead of murder. But Grenfell doesn't happen in a vacuum. 72 people died. They were killed by someone. They're not killed by a local authority. They're not killed by a corporation or a company. Somebody. Companies are run by people. Local authorities are run by people. They were killed by someone. We live in an area where we have a history of the north of the borough being treated completely different and worse than the south of the borough. I mean, the cladding is only put on Grenfell Tower itself for aesthetic reasons. There are no refurbishment reasons. There's nothing about structurally safe about putting it on the building. It is just merely to make it aesthetically pleasing for the south of the borough. And we ultimately 72 people pay with their lives. That's the way that they treat us all the way along. In terms of criminal justice, we pay with our liberty. I mean, Notting Hill, we've had the riots back in the 50s. We had Rackman in terms of housing. The carnival is over policed and seen as generating crime on an annual basis, as opposed to seeing it for what it is, which is a working community standing up and celebrating their history and their past and the shoulders that they stand on to kind of move forward. So we cannot but label it as social murder. And I think if you've seen the inquiry over the last few weeks, we know even as the tower was burning, still burning, the Metropolitan Police were organising a defence in case we rioted. They sent armed police down here to, as an arms against the community, rather than assisting the very people who were escaping that fire and who ultimately lost their lives. So what else are we supposed to call it? What, an accident? It has to be murder. People don't feel comfortable with the term murder, then use manslaughter. But somebody killed those 72 people, and somebody needs to be accountable and responsible for that. And should get the same penalties that if somebody in the community had done it. We can't have a two-tier criminal justice system, whereas because you have a particular job or you own a particular company, that you face the criminal justice system in a completely different way. If it was one of us, we'd be sitting down and remanding one of the HMPs now. It certainly wouldn't have been dragged out for 5 years, I can tell you that much. And we certainly wouldn't be living it up in our villas in Marseille or Marbella while this inquiry was happening. And I know we're going to talk about inquiries later, because I think we've been sold a dud there as well.
Yeah, I think the pattern that always follows is that whoever's responsible for social murder and mass arrests and attacking workers who are fighting for the jobs and communities is that the police and the state are pretty quick to try and cover up their own mistakes, and they will lie about it to do so. So they'll create a false narrative, and I think there are the similarities. It happens frequently that they try and attack us and then they lie about it. So they set up systems to try and attack us. I mean, that's what the systems are there for. That's why armed police or, turn up expecting a riot that they're most likely to cause. Most riots aren't caused by us, they're caused by them. That when the police turn up, it's going to turn nasty. Before the police arrive, everything's okay. They're readily prepared to lie about the mistakes to protect them and their friends, and that's the pattern that runs through all these injustices. And also, nobody is accountable. Nobody in any position of power is held accountable, or anything happened to them. They're not prosecuted. They're, even in cases where it comes out that the blame would lie with them, they find some way of shoving it under the carpet or not making it the main news headline, because they've got their friends in the media who will decide what's headlines and what's not. So it becomes far away from public culture and what people are going to see on the news. They don't value our lives. They have no value for working class people's lives. It is not something that they're bothered about. We saw that through the pandemic. That was social murder, the way that pandemic was managed. Social murder is happening in this country on a grand scale. Neglect, the way they operate with the NHS. And I think it's good to use that language, and I think we ought to use it a lot more. They're keen to blame the victims and the people who are trying to help. And there's this whole thing about the thread that runs through is lies, really, and a false narrative that's created in years and years and years to come. There'll be lies about Grenfell in the same way that there's been lies about Orgreave, lies about Shrewsbury, lies about Hillsborough. Some people might call it being economic with the truth. We need to call it what it is. It's lies for them to cover up what they've done to us.
Yeah, I think you can't understand Orgreave unless you look back the year before. And what happened there was that they gave the police paramilitary powers secretly outside of Parliament, the Home Office, and in a meeting with Willie Whitelaw, the top civil servants and the top police officers, decided that the police should have paramilitary powers, sanctioned by a secret meeting in the Home Office. The Parliament never knew anything about it. So I describe that as they were acting outside of democracy. They were a group of people who were like the enemy within. That's where it all started. That's where it all went wrong. And you saw those powers being applied on the back of a Ridley plan where they wanted to take on the unions one by one. With Grenfell, it's not planned in the same way, but it's inevitable, isn't it? It's the same cause. If you're trying to undermine a union, if that's your main thing, and get rid of the whole communities and an industry, if you extend that to the corporate world and subcontracting and lack of democracy in local people's lives, and you cut corners, it is inevitable that there will be serious ramifications. And here we saw just how far it went. In terms of the material that's put on people's buildings, there's a lack of control, there's a lack of local democracy, there's a lack of health and safety, and people pay with their lives. So the motive is the same. And I didn't know what Yvette said about, that the way they policed it in an emergency is just, it's so indicative of this society, isn't it? That they don't, even when it goes wrong, they don't treat it with care and openness. It's all covering up in the same way that they've done over Orgreave. So there's a link, I think, between that sort of corporate subcontracting, taking away people's power within their unions or in their localities, have these devastating effects on working community.
I suppose there's almost like a causality to it as well, in a way. So I just finished. I recently read Andrew Murray's book, latest book, and there's a chapter in it on public services, and he draws a really interesting comparison between actually the Grenfell Tower being built in 1972 to 1974, at exactly the same time as like a neoliberalism was being born in like Latin America, and then in Britain, I guess you have the sort of that deregulation was paved by smashing the unions, and then further on down the line, that it's still hurting people and killing people because it's that process of neoliberal deregulation that led to, I guess, the social murder of the Grenfell crisis. So there's a kind of it's a horrible story, effectively, I guess. But yeah, and I guess it's interesting too with the policing bill and things like that. Actually, those enlargement of powers. I didn't know that either, Yvette, about the sending the police in for. But
yeah, and I think you've touched on, it is an accumulation of things that pull together that benefit, you've touched on things like deregulation, privatization of our public services, where we always kind of come off the worst for some reason, the no quality checks with, like the tenant management organization, who effectively operated as a private company, but we're delivering and it's all, it's in the small print. We have, regeneration, which is really gentrification, where you kind of move out whole estates, only bring a certain amount of those people back, which kind of destroys communities as well. So there's a whole host of thread behind it. And I think with the Rotten Borough, as we call it, Kensington and Chelsea, one of the richest in the country, but still kind of got on board this political mantra about us living in austerity, while they were sitting down on £274 million in their reserves. But that's the reason that they give. And you're like, what kind of system enables that to happen? And also Lakanal House fire in Camberwell. The government sat on the recommendations from that. Perhaps Grenfell would not have happened. So Grenfell was needless, but you have kind of this combination of things where they're just ruining working communities, and it's up and down the country. There's no north-south divide. They think we're all scum. Let's not try and have no hierarchy there. So they just, at best they're indifferent. At best they don't care. If they want to get away with saying they don't do it deliberately, let's not split hairs. But at best they don't care, and they're indifferent. They have no value on our lives. We really don't matter unless we're earning money for them.
Yeah, profit and power is their complete motivation. And I think, we know that they don't care about us. They're not interested in us or our lives. They're interested in how we can enable them to live better lives. We see that through austerity, as you've mentioned, Yvette, and also through the system of food banks now, which seems to have been normalised. We've got Tories cutting ribbons, opening up food banks. They tried to starve the miners back to work.
Yeah.
They'll use any method to impoverish us, and sadly, a lot of people don't see what's happening because they they're good people who have faith in people and think that people couldn't possibly be that cruel. But they are. And, you know, that's the reality, you know, and I think the sooner people wake up to that, the better it will be for all of us, really.
Yeah, I wonder if we could move on to talk a little bit about the actual. So we talked a lot about the kind of context for Grenfell, the sort of policing context, and the kind of the sort of historic context of Orgreave, which is still very much with us. But maybe look a bit about what actually justice for communities looks like. And obviously, there's an ongoing inquiry right now that you've touched on, Yvette, into what happened at Grenfell. One of the kind of key demands of the Orgreave campaign is for an inquiry. And it'd be good to Matt to maybe get some of your input on what are the kind of barriers that someone who's who's like investigated what police do and what the state does and the kind of context where it's being held to account. So yeah, I don't know, maybe Kate, if you want to kick us off on what does justice for Orgreave look like?
Well, just in terms of just going back to the barriers to justice, we're obviously getting the false narratives, but and Matt will probably want to touch on this more, is the legislative process that we're up against, because any attempts that we're trying to make to try and look into what's happened at Orgreave, a lot of the laws that are in place or are being established now will help to cover up even more anything that happens again that could be similar to Orgreave. And I think we know that that's likely to happen, you know. But are you wanting me to go through what kind of inquiry we would like, or I mean, we're learning very quickly that public inquiries don't necessarily serve the public or the people who want a public inquiry. And our calls for a public inquiry were very firmly rejected by Amber Road, as you'll be aware of, in 2016, based on various grounds of there was no miscarriage of justice, nobody died. It was a long time ago. Policing practices have changed and all that. But we'd want an inquiry that looked into the facts of what happened at Orgreave and during and throughout the miners' strike. So that kind of inquiry really would have to have the power to call all relevant information. So a panel or an inquiry panel would have to be established that would have, you know, the relevant people on it with the right interest and qualifications to be able to examine detailed information. And there is plenty of detailed information out there, although some of it's embargoed until 2066. There's papers at Kew Gardens, not Kew Gardens. I'm getting all romantic there. In the Kew archives. The panel, you know, should have all the relevant skills so that they can gather together all the relevant information from the people who need to be asked the relevant questions and have an interest in it. So we'd expect miners to be there, people who were actually at Orgreave, you know, people who dealt with it before, dealt with it after. And it would have to be transparent. If it's not transparent, then what's the point? And then when the inquiry is sort of finalised, it needs to be thoroughly explained. That narrative needs to be properly explained to the public. It's in the public interest to do that, not to skirt over the issues. And we don't want it to be expensive. We don't want it to go on forever. You know, the information is there. It could happen fairly quickly. But we're being prevented from having it because there's a lot to hide for the Tories. You know, they don't want people to know what they do, which is why they spend most of it covering it up. And as Matt alluded to earlier, they were making very clear plans for how to deal with industrial action. you know, with the steel workers and the miners and various other workers. Those plans were very clear, very well written down in manuals that we don't know the legal status of those manuals, and Parliament didn't even know anything about most of it, not even people on their own side. So, you know, so we'd like all that to come out well and truly in the open. I mean, lots of it's in Matt and Morag's book, but, you know, it needs to be shouted louder with a loud hailer somewhere on the 9 o'clock news.
Yeah, I mean, the argument that Rudd put for we don't need an inquiry is no longer tenable. It wasn't tenable at the time, but she said the policing has improved. We've just had 8 police forces going to special measures. I mean, it's so bad that the state of policing over the year that they're being put into special measures, and the commissioner had to resign. There are a lot of commissioners who've had to resign over the years. We need to put them in a poster as to, you know, all in a poster, because it's pretty appalling as a record. I just wanted to touch on what Kate was saying about the shape of the inquiry. I mean, we know that there've been problems with the undercover inquiry. I'm involved in that. It's taken forever, and it's so slow that we've almost forgotten what the thing was about, which almost seemed intentional. You know, it was supposed to report in 3 years. We still haven't got to the second stage, and there are 3 stages. So we haven't even got to 1982, 1983 yet, you know, so that's how slow it's been. I think one of the reasons it feels less effective is that the argument for a panel was refused. One of the reasons why Macpherson report was much better is that there was a really lovely man called Richard Stone, who's a lovely anti-racist GP, you know, really caring, lovely man, and he reshaped Macpherson on some key issues around racism that really made a crucial difference in terms of the evidence that he received and put into that case. He made it broader and wanted to bring in the sort of, you know, the wider racist stories within the police. So that's absolutely crucial. It obviously needs to be, as Kate said, it needs to involve people who actually care and understand about this issue, right? Which is what happened with the Hillsborough panel, and the massive difference there. So I think where inquiries, the good side of the undercover stuff is that they can compel people to give evidence. So there've been moments where some of the history and the truth comes out because someone is forced to give evidence. And sometimes it's because we've argued, well, actually this person should come and give evidence. And Mitting has said, well, I don't think we do, and then has had to change his mind. And actually they've come with really quite interesting information about what happened at the time. It's obviously very important in particular, I mean, for all sorts of people, but I think particularly for the appalling thing of women who, you know, were having children with police officers. You know, I mean, that's just unbelievable that that's ever happened. I'm not quite sure that could happen anywhere else in the world, to be honest. It just seems absolutely perverse that they could ever countenance that. But I think it's very frustrating, I think, for everyone involved in it, because it's so slow and so piecemeal. And I think that's part of what they do with an establishment inquiry. So the final point I'll finish on that was that I think what happens outside and what can be achieved outside is almost as important as what happens inside a court. With Macpherson, there was an enormous movement outside that really had opened up the court as a public tribunal rather than a stuffy thing. And I know that Grenfell tried, you know, it makes all the difference, doesn't it? When people in the local, there's a pressure on the court. It's lovely to see people up in the balconies, and it opens it up, and you can feel that this is not something that is just taken away from people's experience. But it does feel that's too slow as well with Grenfell, and that it can hold up other activities sometimes that would happen because people are having to wait. So we need to bear that in mind for all the future, for the future. But we have to get one for Orgreave, because the justification for not having one is it doesn't exist. You know, it is completely untenable, and because there is information that we can't get to, and because people were brutally treated, and it needs to be dealt with officially, and they need to have justice.
I also think one of the terrible, heartbreaking situations that we're in is that we're all getting older. You know, a lot of the miners have died. A lot of the community are dying. Some people took their own lives because of what happened during the miners' strike. You know, it was you know, terrible, the effect it had on their lives, families, communities, jobs. The sheer and utter heartbreak of it all, and the way it's been stalled and delayed, you know, it's devastating. We've got activists who've dropped out because of ill health, and because, you know, they can't even walk on a demonstration anymore. It's got to happen soon, because it's got to happen in people's lifetimes.
I think it's just it's almost heartbreaking at times listening to what Matt and Kate have just said. Matt, I don't know if you know, but actually Dr. Richard Stone, as we knew him, was a great supporter of the mangrove in Notting Hill for absolutely years. And actually he used Notting Hill as a training ground for William Macpherson to come down so he could get some insight into how our communities operate. So it was kind of really disappointing when we were offered an inquiry, you know, a couple of days after Grenfell. Never take anything that the government offers you quickly. It's always going to go wrong. You know, that we then had to fight to say, can we have a panel? You know, and they made, you know, bereaved families and the survivors who were at their most traumatized have to fight for that. Whereas we'd already told them what had happened with the Lawrence inquiry. So they already had information about that. And then the complete refusal for them to add race or class in as part of the terms of reference. We knew then that something was going to go wrong later on. You know, by the time we'd got information about Orgreave still asking for an inquiry, that even made us more suspicious of, we get one 2 days after they've been fighting for one for 30 odd years, something's not right here. I mean, where it led us to was who actually benefited from inquiries. Even if we use the Lawrence inquiry as having an excellent outcome, actually one of the things that inquiry is supposed to produce is truth. And we know that inquiry didn't, because some 20 years later, the family's campaign, they felt like they were being spied upon. So, you know, what do public inquiries mean? We don't know the full criteria for who gets an inquiry or not. We know that from Orgreave. We've mentioned money before. They are hugely expensive. Okay. The government decides who gets an inquiry. The government signs off the terms of reference. The government appoints the judge. And then after you go all through that, then actually there's no legal requirement for the government to take on board any recommendations or findings from that inquiry. And we see that in its worst form when the two police officers stand in the dock for Hillsborough, where the court actually said, it's not a problem to change your statements. You can give a different one at the inquiry. You can give a different one in terms of your criminal statement, because public inquiries are not legal entities. So just do what you like. And we saw that at the beginning of phase 2 with Grenfell, where the corporates come in and just say, actually, any evidence that we give here, we don't want it to be taken into consideration if there are prosecutions later down the line. And the Attorney General grants it to them. So they're not actually public inquiries. It's just government inquiries with them marking their own homework. And then they're played with delays. Justice delayed, justice denied. And it's about it falling out of the public consciousness
Yeah.
so that they move on to something else. You look at the inquiries at the moment, you know, Grenfell's just finishing, you know, we've got COVID coming up, we've got the post office, undercover policing is still going. And I think this is all of a plan to kind of keep us in that place, break us down to the point where you just can't fight anymore because you've got your kids to feed, you've got to keep a roof over your head. There's so many other things going on that's their plan to kind of shut us down. So my plan for the future is that if they are really public inquiries, let them be run by the public. We will put our own chairs in. If we need legal, it doesn't have to be a judge. If we need a legal advisor, we've got legal advisors in our community who've worked very hard to get to where they've got to get to. So if they're public inquiries, make them truly public in the sense, be transparent about the criteria that people have to fit into in order to get one, and then make it a legal requirement for actually Parliament to act on that, rather than slapping people in the face all the time and just saying, ping-ponging it between the two houses in Parliament and nobody getting any outcome, especially with Grenfell. Well, we've got thousands of people across the country still living in homes that could catch fire tonight.
Yeah. And I think the terrible irony is that, you know, people demonstrate as they did at Orgreave, picketing, you know, to save the jobs and communities, and they get abused for standing up for themselves. You know, we are being abused for standing up for our rights, and those laws are getting worse and worse and worse. You know, we could find ourselves, all of us, in a bizarre situation where we're fighting for each other's rights, and one of us or all of us could be arrested, and before we know it, we're fighting for the rights of those being arrested, getting arrested for fighting for our rights. You know, it's just like this vicious circle. I mean, you couldn't make it up. It's just completely crazy and very, very disturbing.
I wonder if we could just as a kind of last question and go back to that point that Matt kind of alluded to, and actually Yvette, you were kind of talking about it too, and Kate, that whole idea of the struggle going on in the inquiry, but also needing a big movement outside of the room that is pushing hard to get the things that you kind of outlined, Yvette. So like, how do we, and I know actually, for example, that the Grenfell campaign, the Orgreave campaign, have worked very closely together, especially with the Hillsborough campaign and Shrewsbury campaigns and other justice campaigns. And obviously, yeah, Matt, you've spoken at those sorts of meetings as well and offered your views there. And there's been a kind of network of solidarity that's been really positive to see. So yeah, my kind of final question would be, how do we build the campaign? How do we get more people involved? How do we get more people on the marches for Grenfell and going to Orgreave on June the 18th every year? Yeah. So how do we make it bigger?
Well, sorry, Matt.
I feel actually, whilst there is a lot of misery and there's a lot of things that are getting worse, I feel very optimistic about how angry people are and how the people are not going to put up with what the argument that's been put for years as austerity. We have to just plod along. I went to the RMT rally outside King's Cross. It was the best meeting I've been to for years. And he made this point, Mick Lynch, that they've done more in a week than political parties have done in years. And the whole crowd, just everybody instantaneously cheered. And it was like a release of this sort of dead weight that we've had, particularly with Starmer, who's incapable of opposing anything, and with what the government argument, you know, so there's that sense that we can't actually do anything. It is changed now. I definitely feel it. I mean, this morning I went to they won't call it picket line, but essentially it was a picket line of barristers outside the Royal Courts of Justice who were on strike. I mean, that's sort of unheard of. And people are just fed up with the way that they've been treated for years, the way that services are run down, the way that pay is miles behind inflation. And one aspect of that is the police are in crisis, absolute crisis. No one says anymore, oh, that's one bad apple. that argument has not been put for a very long time, because it's just not sustainable, because these things just happen every week. There's another crisis, just like every week there's a Tory scandal, a Tory groper or whatever. So I definitely I don't feel optimistic about what the Labour Party's doing. I don't, obviously, and I'm obviously worried about how much the Tories will try and steal while they're in power. But I don't think they're going to be able to enforce more repression in a way that isn't going to lead to mass reaction, and that the police cannot police everything. If things are big and lively, they will back off on using their discretion. And I think we're in that mood where people are just not going to put up with it. And so you're absolutely right. It's about bringing those groups together, making those links, people knowing about the dates of the Grenfell and the Orgreave, and they become in their diaries, just like the date, for people who are deaths in custody, that those events come together. But I also think the industrial thing is the thing that really breaks it, when you see unions coming out and stopping services and having power and potential to win. I think that will give so much more confidence to those campaigns, and further links and places where they can go and speak and join together, and give strength to those campaigns, because the union movement still exists and still has a lot of power. So I feel the next year things will go up and down. I'm not saying there won't be depressing days, but I feel very optimistic that people have had enough and want to do something about it.
I certainly feel that working with other campaigns, meeting wonderful people like Yvette and Matt and Sam, us all working together, there's nothing like it. They say there's nothing like solidarity, you can't beat it, and it's absolutely true, and you kind of feed off each other. But I also think while we're commemorating, Grenfell and Orgreave, we also need to look at ways of celebrating, and I think a lot of us do that quite well. I mean, we have quite a few celebratory events with the Orgreave campaign. We've got one coming up in November, a comedy and music night, but we've had celebrations of our history. We did quite a lot of really great stuff online, where we were celebrating the artwork that was created throughout the miners' strike, the plates, the paintings, the badges, the posters, the gigs, all those kinds of events. And we need to look after each other, and I do think we need to do positive things together, as well as the obvious things about commemoration and reminders. And we can actually celebrate, great things like the Shrewsbury success. I think that's something to celebrate, along with many others. We celebrated Saltley Gate this time, instead of just commemorating Orgreave. We were able to celebrate again an anniversary of Saltley Gate. I do feel optimistic about people's resistance, and I do feel optimistic about us all, joining together and looking after each other.
That's absolutely amazing, and thank you for mentioning Saltley Gate, because I grew up in Saltley, Birmingham, and I really think I was politicised from there, because my father, who was a British rail worker at the time, had to go down to take some sandwiches to a friend of his who was on one of the picket lines for the miners. And I said to him, as a bright, I won't give away my age, what's it got to do with you? And he very told me what it had to do with him. And I bring that through with me wherever I go. So, forming alliances has been the best thing whatsoever for us. We have more in common than we have in difference. We're stronger together. We're taking our steel band to the gala, and every one of those young people are now a member of the union. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to come. I think the unions are powerful. They shouldn't be sitting aside from us. Our union members live in our communities. We should all be one. And I think, if we all get together and go, there's no stopping us, really. We just need to go. And we need to remember, we're fighting to win. We're not just fighting for the sake of
Yeah.
it. We want to make a change. We're fighting to win here.
And we will.
And we will.
And we will. On that inspiring note, because we will win, it's been absolutely great talking to the three of you. Thanks so much for speaking at Arise this year. And to those who have been watching, again, if you like events like this, if you've enjoyed this conversation, do head to our Eventbrite page. Like I say, the links in the just under the video, and see what else has got going on. If you've enjoyed this video too, share it with your mates, post it onto Twitter and Facebook, and and get more people involved, because together we're going to win. That's I think that's the take home. And as ever, please hit that donate button if you can. And I'll hopefully see you all at other events on the festival.